Okay, here's our next lecture on the industrial city, and really what we're going to focus on is the city and immigration. So here is the growth of urbanization. We had taken a look at a map like this last year with the first industrial revolution, and that trend of growing urbanization and immigration is going to continue and really exacerbate and grow throughout the second industrial revolution. And you'll notice the big big urban centers are going to continue to be New York, around Philadelphia, Baltimore, outside of Boston, Chicago, St. Louis, and even San Francisco there in the west. And all of these in the New England area are really from industrialization. Chicago, of course, being the hub for the meatpacking industry, and San Francisco and Oakland growing up around mining. So you have the old immigrants that we talked about last year from the first industrial revolution. They were the famine Irish, they were Germans, and these are going to be the old immigrants because we're about to experience a new wave of immigration. So old immigrants go with the first industrial revolution, the older one, and new immigrants go with the newer industrial revolution, or the second one. And they had a pattern of staying in cities because of church and social networks. They tend to be Catholic, and that's going to be true of a lot of the new immigrants. So here's a map of immigration, and you'll notice a few changes. The northern and western immigrants, although they do keep coming, their line is trending downward, and the new immigrants are really coming from southern and eastern Europe, and that's going to be a defining aspect of the new immigrants. From 1880 to 1820, this is 40 years. This is going to continue until after World War I and come to an end in the 1920s. 23 million immigrants, much more than the old immigrants, come looking to the United States, looking mainly for jobs in the expanding economy. They're from Eastern and Southern Europe. That means along the border with Russia, in the Baltic areas, in the Slavic areas, and down into Italy. They tend to be Catholics and Jews, and they're not Protestant. So a lot of you, if you're Italian, which I know is a good portion of you, if you're Jewish, another good portion of you, this is when your families started coming to the United States. A lot of Jews come to escape the pogroms, which are organized violence against religious minorities, specifically the Jews in Eastern Europe, that was being allowed in the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They tend to keep their languages, keep their religious traditions. They tend not to assimilate so much to American culture. They created ethnic newspapers, schools, and social associations, a lot of times for Catholics organized around the church. And unfortunately, this is also going to lead to a resurgence of nativism and attempts to limit immigration. We kind of looked at one of those attempts because I would also include the Chinese as part of these new immigrants. They're not coming from Eastern and Southern Europe, they're coming from Asia, but they're coming during this time period, and eventually it'll also spread to more Asian immigrants, Pan-Asian immigrants, especially Japan. And we've seen the Chinese Exclusion Act. Here is a Rosh Hashanah card because there tends to be strong ties between the old world and the new. On the left you see the American eagle, the American flag, and on the right you see the Eastern immigrants, and above them the flag and seal of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So these new immigrants coming from Central and Southern Europe as well as Asia flood into the cities, and American cities grow by 700%. These immigrants are going to fuel the urbanization and the industrialization because they are going to become the workers in the factories, especially these green hands that tend to flood factory jobs. And they're not just immigrants from Europe, but also from America. Whether they're coming from Europe or America, you see a shift from rural areas, rural immigrants, to the cities. And that's again because of the jobs available to them in factories. And like the old immigrants, the new immigrants, especially the foreign-born populations, tend to go into cities and congregate and live by people of similar ethnicity. And so New York City, which a lot of you are very familiar with, is a very good example of that. In New York City we have places like Chinatown and Little Italy where new immigrants coming into the country, because Little Italy would be Southern Europe's Italian immigrants, Chinatown would be the Asian immigrants. But even in New York City you see places like Little Budapest and Little Hungary, I think there's a little Warsaw neighborhood for the Polish immigrants. And so you're going to have these little ethnic enclaves, kind of intending that we're not really assimilating. It's not a melting of cultures, but rather a separation, more like a salad bowl effect in the United States. Preying on a lot of these immigrants and helping them at the same time, it's a bit of a juxtaposition, are the urban political machines. We'll be talking about Boss Tweed in class. I'm watching a video on him. But Tammany Hall, which again we talked about with the first industrial revolution, the Tammany Hall Society has become a political machine for the Democratic Party in New York City. Chicago is also going to have a very strong Democratic political machine, but really none of them are famous or as infamous as Tammany Hall. Boss Tweed is going to be the head of the corrupt Tweed ring that runs Tammany Hall. They're going to use a spoils system, graft, and patronage to, in some ways, help the urban poor get jobs, get food, and they're going to build public works like the Brooklyn Bridge and the New York City courthouse to employ these immigrants in return for their votes. And that's why they're a machine, because they keep on functioning. They provide jobs, which get them votes, which allow them to provide more jobs, which allows them to get more votes. And so it continues on like a machine would. I mentioned the New York City courthouse because of the manner in which it's built. It's supposed to cost $250,000, but in the end costs $13 million. And if you would inflate that to 2000, that's going to be about $500 million. Why is that? Because of this patronage system. They would provide jobs to friends of Tammany Hall, and they would bill maybe $50 for a toilet. Now, that toilet probably only cost $1. What do you do with the other $49? Well, that person takes a little off the top and then gives a kickback to the Tammany Hall Society, and probably the person who specifically gave them the job, most likely called a sachem, like Native Americans. And all of this is part of the scheming, the skimming off the top, taking the money from the city and distributing it to the Tammany Hall Society members, and less, but still a significant number, to the actual laborers. And this is all part of how New York City is run. That's how the Brooklyn Bridge is built. And it's the system of patronage that we had seen part of like during the Jacksonian period. Here you see a picture on the right of a Tammany Hall barbecue, supporters coming and getting free food, and of course that leads to stronger support for Tammany Hall. Where does this urban population live? Well, they're going to live more and more in things called dumbbell tenements, named because they look like actual dumbbells that you would use at the gym. They're narrow in the center to allow a small air shaft in between the buildings, and then they're lined up like you see here, often 2, 3, or even more, sometimes up to 4 in a row. However, these tend to be fire hazards. There's no real heating system, so you have open flames and log fires in them. They tend to have very poor sanitation. If you look in here, you really only see 2 WCs or 2 restrooms for an entire 4 floors, so you share with your neighbors. But you also see the spread of things like waterborne illnesses and airborne illnesses like tuberculosis, influenza. The best record we really have of these dumbbell tenements come from a foreign-born, Czech-born photographer named Jacob Rees. He himself is one of these new immigrants to the United States, and he's a photojournalist, and he makes a collection of pictures of New York City and the urban poor and publishes them in a book called How the Other Half Lives. And this is going to be one of the more influential books, especially of the late Gilded Age. His pictures tend to show the cramped and squalid living conditions. These are basically hammocks that rent out like bunk beds, and the picture is called Bunks in 7-cent Housing. You could rent one of these bunk beds for 7 cents, and you probably rent it for about 8 hours. So here's a picture from a 5-cent lodging house. If you look closely, I believe you can actually see 6 different men cramped in these quarters, and on the right it looks like some kind of stove. And here's again another very good example. These men are sleeping on the floor on just newspapers, and in the corner you see wood piled up and an old wood-burning stove, hence leading to why these places are such fire hazards and health hazards. I mean, you can just imagine all the rats that run around and spread disease. Despite all of this, there's a boom in housing during the period. If you look at the percentage increases of some of the cities, look at Seattle. It's really one of those boom towns in the West, 21% increase. San Francisco only shows 130% increase, but it's probably already experienced its own 10,000% increase before this during the gold rush that would have been 10 years earlier. New York City only has 132% increase. But again, it also was heavily hit by the first wave of the old immigrants. It's also been experiencing steady growth from 1860 to 1870 and is going to continue growing, especially until like the 1920s. The significant thing, I keep on saying the 1920s, it's a big deal because by 1920, for the first time in U.S. history, we're mainly an urban nation. Over half of Americans live in cities. Before, we had always been a rural nation. One thing that's allowing like the buildup, especially of these tenements and buildup of corporations and cities, are skyscrapers and the growth of the suburbs. As the urban poor moves into the city, the upper middle class and the rich often start moving out of the city to the outskirts. Now, some rich, like on Madison Fifth Avenue, will keep their mansions far away from like the Lower East Side where the immigrants live. But a lot of the middle class start moving to the suburbs, and this is how places like Brooklyn, the Bronx are born. The Chicago Fire of 1871, our summer reading talked about it, and allowed Chicago to really become at the forefront of architecture with the building of new design. And men like Burnham, Sullivan, and Root move away from that Beaux Arts style of imitating classical architecture like that was used at the Great Exposition, and move towards a more iron steel based skyscraper. And this has actually started before the Great Exposition. You had read about it in your book, but this new steel that's stronger and more sturdy allows us to build up much taller than we were ever able to with wood. And also the new floating foundations that they use allow it to be implemented first in Chicago and then on the marshy island of Manhattan. But it's going to dramatically change the American landscape, and they're going to figure out ways to build higher and higher. Though these skyscrapers become what the basis of what the tenement buildings are, but also big corporate buildings. The Prudential building in New York City is very famous for its architecture, one of the first skyscrapers. And so with that comes a central business district with both working and upper class residents, and middle class increasingly moves to the suburbs as you have the addition of elevated transit, rapid transit, and streetcars to a lot of American cities. San Francisco is famous for its trolley, and the New York subway begins in the 1880s and the 1890s actually as an elevated line. Now, if you go to Chicago, it's still an elevated line. In Chicago, we call it the L. And so this extension of transportation is going to start a new trend that we're going to talk about throughout US too, and that's suburbanization. So throughout the 20th century, this is the beginning as suburbs are going to be increasingly middle class and white, while inner cities are going to be mainly lower class and more multicultural. So the city and the environment is not going to be good. We've read about the summer, especially like the City Beautiful movement, and it's because of the bad environment that this movement's necessary. You have overcrowding, inadequate sanitation. Back then, no cities provided clean water or sewage treatment plants, and so this is going to be the beginning of a desire for that, being able to buy clean, purified water from the city, though for a long time is going to be something available only to the middle and upper class. And it's going to be the progressive reformers in the 1890s that are going to start wanting to provide these things to all city inhabitants. Creating things like garbage dumps on nearby rural land is going to be important, because we read about in the summer reading that people would just put their trash in the streets and then eventually wait for a strong rain to carry it out into the ocean, or in Chicago into Lake Michigan, in New York City out into the ocean and bays, which then leads to a polluting of the waterways. And so several cities like Chicago, but also San Francisco right around the turn of the century, are going to experience devastating fires. And at least for Chicago and San Francisco, it's going to allow them to re-engineer the city as new architects come in and transform the urban landscape and start to put in infrastructure that's going to be so important to part of the City Beautiful movement. Here's a good question. I suggest you figure out how to answer it before class. This is the end of the lecture for today, the end of the industrial city. We'll pick up next time with the rise of the consumer society.